Instant, free, download. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad to be here, and I've got some fun things that I'm excited to share with you. I'm really looking forward to tonight. And so to get us kicked off here, you know that we're talking about pioneers. That's our subject tonight. And I'm going to tell you some pioneer stories that I really enjoy, really love. But I'm really going to spend my time talking about why we talk about the pioneers. Now, the last pioneer came across the plains 120, carry the 3, multiply the 2, like 140 years ago, 150 years or whatever ago. And we're still talking about them. And there's good reason to be talking about them. We should be, and I wish we could talk more about them, in fact. And so in addition to some of the stories that I want to share with you, that I'm going to share with you, I hope to impress on you a little bit as to why we share the pioneer stories and why I wish more people would share more stories. To get us started, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to give you my screen, and I'm going to take you somewhere here real quick. So bear with me just as it's loading up. Okay, you're going to be familiar with this website. Okay, familysearch.org. Now, maybe I'm just not smart enough to figure it out, but I can't do what I'm going to show you on a mobile device, but on a tablet, laptop, desktop, it works. Okay, so after you log in, you're going to come up here to the top right corner with that little question mark is. Click on that, go to Helper Resources. You click on Helper Resources and your name's going to come up, or you can add somebody if you want to do what I'm going to show you for somebody else. But let's just do for me here. I'm going to show you this. It's going to take just a couple of minutes. It's going to get you super excited. You're probably going to stop watching this video and just go do this yourself. It's that thrilling. Okay, but look at all these things that you can select, and everything that the church has done that's on the screen right now is now tied to you when you log in. Right now, you're seeing it tied to me. So we've got some very wonderful people down at the Church History Library that have been called as missionaries, and they're taking all these books and volumes and stuff, vaults of paperwork, saved documents, and they're scanning them to make them searchable for us. And then some smart individual figured out how to connect all those scanned documents and tie them in to your account. In this case, what you're seeing, my account. And so the work that's going on down there at that library is amazing, what they're doing. And it seems like they're just kind of scratching the surface. When the Lord gave the commandment, you can read it in Doctrine and Covenants, to keep a record. And boy, have our faithful members of the church kept a record. Somewhere there's an attic full of boxes of old journals and paperwork and documents, and our missionaries are scanning them as fast as they can and getting them accessible to us. But let me show you here how awesome this is. And since finding this out, my kids, this is how they spend a lot of their Sunday afternoon, is right here on this page. So once you're logged in, you can click on Pioneer Ancestors, and now it comes up with everybody I'm related to that walked across, or didn't necessarily walk across the plains, but came across the plains. This guy, John Staley, he departed at age 13 in 1862. And if I wanted to, which I do want to do, is I can click on photos and stories. And then look at this, John Staley. Look at all these pictures. I'm related to this guy. All these pictures come up of my ancestor. And now here's the stories. You want to know, if I want to know the story about it, about this individual, here he is. Let's go to another one here. Look at this guy, William Livingston, departed at age 7. And I think, man, that's awesome. And it took him 86 days to come across, left Mormon Grove, Kansas in July of 1855. And who is William Livingston? Click on relationship, and there he is. Oh, I know, I see my mom, my grandma, my grandpa, it's his dad. So my two great grandpas is who that is. And so there's all your pioneer stories. So if you think you had somebody who came across the plains, or if you know that somebody did come across the plains from your family tree, you hit this red icon, and there it all is. Let me show you, I kind of breezed over it, kind of the thrilling part let's see, Rebecca Hill. Okay, I know her relationship. I want to go to her stories. I don't know, if I do, but if I didn't know anything about Rebecca Hood Hill, I can come here, see all of her pictures, but more importantly than that, right here at the top in the middle, it says Memory 63. That means there's 63 documents of information about her. So I can click on that, and here's all the documents where she's either mentioned, or here's their Bible birth and death records. You're going to find her journals. Here's stories either told by her or her children or sisters or somebody has a story, and they uploaded it. So now I can I can lay in bed with my iPad and just read 63 documents full of stories about my great-great-grandma. Okay, now you come back here, you can look at the headstones. If any of them were children, you get their stories. Ancestor Challenge is kind of fun. It throws pictures up and it says, who is this? And it gives you multiple choice options, and you get to guess your ancestor's name. So you really start to get to know them. If you come down here, you can start to see their temple ordinances, not only that the ordinances were done, but where they were done. What temple were they done in? If you go here, this one I've spent a lot of time in. This is the missionary one. So now it's searching right now for everybody that they've documented. These missionaries down at the Church History Library have documented mission records. And the really smart system here is connecting me to all those scanned documents. So David Hoagland Cannon, he was my great-grandpa. He was called to the British mission at the age of 19. He served from 1912 to 1914. If I wanted to click View Relationships so I know who he is, I could do that. Or I could go to View Missionary. And here's all of his information. There's his set-apart date, his end date, his priesthood office, where he was living when he was called, who he was set apart by. So you can find out that your ancestor was set apart by an apostle, maybe. You come down here to Stories and Documents, click on those, and you not only get the stories and documents, or not, you don't only get the stories, but you also get to see the documents. And these are the real deal. So, and I've done this, I won't take the time now, but for my grandpa Cannon, great-grandpa Cannon, if clicking this link here in the middle of your screen, it pulls up his mission call, and says that you're hereby called to serve as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You're called to labor in the British Isles mission. But more important than that to me is his response, or his acceptance letter. So his letter goes back to Heber J. Grant, I think was the prophet. And he writes this letter, and I find it just by clicking this button. The letter pops up, and it's not just what words he said, it's actually his handwriting, the document of his handwriting, signed by him, sent to the prophet. And in it, he says, thank you very much for the call. I'm glad to serve. I want to serve. However, I'm in the middle of my school semester, and if I leave at the date that you want me to leave on, then I'll miss the end of the semester, and all the schoolwork I've done gets erased. I have to start over. And so if it's okay with you, president of the church, could I go a month later? But here's the awesome thing, is he says in that letter, as he's closing that letter, he says, but if it's not convenient for me to leave, convenient to the church meaning, if it's not convenient for me to leave on my mission after the school semester, I'll go during my semester, and I'll come back and I'll redo it. Doesn't matter, because I'm going to go serve the Lord. Now, what's the most important thing about that letter to me and to my children? Was his handwriting to the prophet. The most important thing is that final paragraph. I will go and do the things the Lord's commanded, even if it's at the expense of my schooling education. And so what a testimony thing that is. That's really cool when my kids run onto that. Let me show you just a couple more things, and we'll jump into some stories and the other things that you might have been expecting in this video. Excuse me. Here it says Nauvoo. See if any of your relatives lived in Nauvoo at the time of Joseph Smith. What's awesome about this is these records used to only be available in Nauvoo. You either had to call up a good sister missionary that was in Nauvoo,
give them your ancestors' info. They download all these documents and stories and everything, and then they'd ship it to you on a thumb drive. That was one option, or the other option is you have to go to Nauvoo to get those documents. Well, not anymore. You log in, you click Nauvoo, and now all of your relatives who lived in Nauvoo, there's Grandma Rebecca again, anybody who was in Nauvoo at the time that the saints were there is going to pop up, and then you can go to that see her page button right there in blue in the middle, and all of those documents and all of those records start populating. They weren't married in Nauvoo, but this is Rebecca's husband. They would marry later. And so all of them, Grandma Susan, Grandpa Cannon, they're all here. And with just the click of a button, I've got all of their records, all of their pictures. And it's really, you'd spend a lot of time here. Last thing I'll show you on the website is they've now got a link for the Joseph Smith Papers. Now, you've heard of the Joseph Smith Papers. It's a multi-volume work, thousands and thousands of pages. You can buy individual volumes for like 80 or 90 bucks, or you can log into the Joseph Smith Papers online and see everything for free on your computer or laptop or even on your phone. And so it's all accessible for free. But once you tie it into this family search website, you can click on Joseph Smith Papers. And now what it's doing is it's looking for all of my relatives that are mentioned in the Joseph Smith paper documents. And so the first one that pops up, William Clayton. You see down at the bottom in the middle, he is mentioned 371 times in the Joseph Smith Papers. Now, William Clayton, you may have heard that name. He was a secretary of the prophet, and so he gets a lot of mention in there. He was heavily involved with Joseph in the Nauvoo period. One of the individuals who went to Carthage after the martyrdom to bring documents and books and personal artifacts back to Nauvoo. But some lesser things, James Lake, he's mentioned 2 times. I have no idea who James Lake is, so I click view your relationship, and up at the top left, my first cousin 7 times removed. Well, that's cool. So now I can, oops, it's gone now, but I could have clicked that link, and now I can go to the Joseph Smith Papers where Grandpa Lake was mentioned 2 times. And you really start to get to know your ancestors here. And it's quite amazing. There's a lot of fun things here. Compare a face. It takes your picture, and then it scans all the pictures, all the ones that we were just looking at, but all the pictures of all your relatives, and it tells you who you look like. It put me as looking like my dad. Like we had a 43%. You know, it said, okay, here's me and here's my dad, and we look alike 43%. Whatever that means, I don't know. But my son, my 8-year-old son, he's goofing around with it, takes his picture. It pulls up my dad. My dad's in here because he's passed away, but it pulls up my dad, and my son and my dad look alike to 71%. So it's like, holy smokes, you know, now my son, who's never met his grandpa, all of a sudden has this instant connection with his grandpa. And now he's asking me all the time to tell him stories about grandpa. He's thrilled to death to be learning about his ancestors. So it comes the question that I started here with. Why is it that the Lord has done so much in preserving a record so that you and I and everybody else can learn about these pioneers? There's got to be some benefit to it other than just being pretty cool and awesome, I would think. Let me bring you back to me. Okay, hopefully I got you back. And so this is why I get excited about it, and I think a few other people do too, perhaps. I want to tell you a couple of stories, and then I'll conclude with a thought or two as well to kind of tie it all together. But here we've got the saints. Pioneer stories. Where did the pioneers come from? How did it all happen? Why did they all jump in wagons or pull hand carts and start moving west? Let me give you a historical background a little bit of the saints. So the saints, we remember their faith is what carried them from wherever they started to Salt Lake Valley. There was nothing else that got them there. They had no business being out on the plains. They didn't have the skills. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the experience. All they had was their faith in God, our Savior, in Joseph Smith being a prophet, in the Book of Mormon, and that stewardship of being a prophet has now fallen to Brigham's lot, and he is now God's spokesperson on earth, and he says it's time to go, and this is where we're going to go. With that in their hearts, they had nothing else to go on. Literally, they sing the song, "Come, come, ye saints," and it's, "We'll find the place which God for us prepared," far away in the west, I guess. These good individuals crossed the Mississippi River, many of them, and walked 1,325 miles to the Salt Lake Valley, not even knowing where they were going to go. All they knew is that the prophet said to do something, and they did it because they had faith, they had a testimony. And in sharing pioneer stories with my children, I hope that's what they glean from the stories. It's just that. So how did we get there? And what caused them to have such faith, not even knowing where they were going? Now, Joseph said that they were going to settle in the Great Basin in the Rocky Mountains. Brigham had seen it in vision. So when he arrived in the valley, July 24th, 1847, he recognized the place. He didn't just feel that this was good, or, hey, we've gone far enough, or those mountains sure are big, I don't think our enemies would dare cross them to get us. It was, this is the place that I ... that I saw. Now, he only said this is the place, or this is the right place, move on. But this is the right place because this, in Brigham's words, it could have been, this is the right place because this is what I saw in vision. So the faith, why was faith so required? We say faith in every footstep. Well, how come? Was it faith to make it another day? Faith to take one more step? Faith that the Lord would send a buffalo so that the company would eat before they starved to death? Faith that the whole family would make it to Salt Lake? Yes, all of those things are correct. But why did they have to have the faith? We'll find the place which God for us prepared far away in the west. They didn't know where they were going. Now, what am I alluding to? This is the first time in our history that they were just taking a step into the dark, so to speak, and hoping that a little bit of light would shine in front of them to give them enough confidence to take another step or two. And this is why. Joseph lived in Manchester. That's where the house was. We say Palmyra, but it was like right on the border. It was technically in Manchester, upstate New York, and where he had the first Vision Smith family farm. The Hill Cumorah is in Manchester. So he's in Manchester. He moves down to Harmony. He goes from Harmony to Fayette. It's in Fayette that the church was organized April 6, 1830. He sends the first missionaries out. The first missionaries are headed out to preach to the Lamanites, which Joseph defined as the American Indian. They had been removed to the outside of the United States, are now in Kansas territory. We send some missionaries out, 4 original missionaries, and they stop over in Kirtland, Ohio, and they preach, and they have wonderful success there in Kirtland, a neighboring Mentor. So much so that 2 individuals, one by the name of Sidney Rigdon and the other by the name of Edward Partridge, decide they want to go to Fayette, New York, and meet the prophet. So they go to Fayette, they meet the prophet. Sidney suggests to Joseph, we've got more saints in the Mentor, Kirtland area, and we have no persecution. Maybe you ought to come out west with us. Joseph says, this is a great idea. Maybe I'll pray about it. He prays about it. He gets the revelation that says, go to the Ohio, and there I will give unto you my law and endow you with power from on high. So the saints go to Kirtland. Now, who's in Kirtland? People Joseph knew. Those 4 missionaries are having wonderful success. Sidney and Edward are there. They know where they're going. They know what they're getting into. Just as it had been the case when he left Manchester. He knew Harmony. Before he lived there, he worked there. And it was Emma's hometown. From Harmony, they go to Fayette. Why to Fayette? Because that's where the Whitmers lived, and the Whitmers are friends of Oliver Cowdery. So Oliver says, yeah, I've been to the farm. It's great. It's big. There's plenty of room. It's going to be awesome. And there's no persecution. Let's go. So they knew where they were going. They knew where they were going to Kirtland. When Kirtland story is happening, the Missouri story is happening. And so as the Saints get driven out of Jackson County and move into Caldwell County and establish Far West, then Joseph and the Saints in Kirtland start receiving some persecution, and they've got to get out of town. Where do they go? They go to Far West. But when you think about Far West, yeah, they know a ton about Far West. We've got a lot of Saints down there in Far West. Joseph had been to Missouri several times on missions, by foot, of course, and he knew exactly where they were going. So they get there, and they're there, and then they have to get driven out of Far West. And where do they go? Well, they go east. There's no other place to go. And do they know where they're going? Maybe not as well as Kirtland and Harmony and Far West, but they know that there's a place called Commerce. And Joseph says, let's get to Commerce. We're talking with the guy who owns the property. We're making the deals. We're working it out. And that's where we're going to end up. So they at least knew where they were going. And a lot of people maybe weren't from Commerce or neighboring, see where they went first. But a lot of the Saints had either traveled through or around or near that area, or missionaries had, not directly, but within 100 or so miles at least. And so they were at least familiar with, well, when we get there, we at least know what it's going to look like. And we know what kind of food we can get and the timber to make houses and that sort of stuff. And so they had confidence in going. Well, then they get to Nauvoo. The martyrdom takes place June 27th, 1844. And the mob, so gracious and kind of them, give them about 18 months to get out of town. Or at least it's going to take 18 months to get out of there. Excuse me. I'm getting my 18 months mixed up. It takes them about 18 months until they start leaving. It takes about 18 months to get everybody out. So 2 sets of 18. So they know they got to go. And now here comes back to faith in every footstep. Here, for the first time in our history, they didn't know where they were going. No one had ever been to the Great Basin. No one had ever come back with a scouting report. Brigham Young was in the first company, the first group that was heading out across the Mississippi, across Iowa, establishing winter quarters, and then making 1,325 miles past there into the Great Basin. My grandpa, Thomas Cloward, was one of 2 individuals who were set ahead as scouts that entered into the Salt Lake Valley, turned around and came back and said, yeah, we think this is it, Brigham, but we need you to verify. They were only 2 or 3 days ahead. And so no one was giving this report back. Hey, there's going to be a river. We're going to be able to cultivate farms. Timber, there was none when they got to the valley. So that's the faith that they had. And faith in every footstep will find the place which God for us prepared far away in the west. And so when we talk about pioneer-like faith, it's stepping, as Elder Packer described, it's as if stepping into the dark and having faith that the next step or 2 will be illuminated. And so it was for them. And that's just what they did. So we can learn a lot of just faith. We go out on treks. We take the youth. And I've been on several treks. I'm a big time fan of them. But a lot of the times the focus is on, we can do hard things. There's difficult things and we can endure. Yes, that's true. And I think that's the second thing we can learn from our pioneer heritage. The first being faith in God the Father will find the place which God for us prepared. Now, another reason I love church history is because it's so relatable. Nephi says that we should liken the scriptures to ourselves. And I say, I wish more people would echo this, but I say that we should liken church history to ourselves, because they went through some hard things, but they had to do it only with faith. They had no other information, no understanding, no reassurance from somebody else that says, yeah, I've been to Salt Lake. It's okay. They didn't have any of that. And so it was just pure, unfiltered faith. And what's the first principle in law and ordinance? What's the first principle of the gospel? Faith. And they had it. And so the first thing that I wish that we would learn from these Trek reenactments is not how to starve ourselves or how to walk 6 miles in a day, although that's fun and I love it and I'll do it again. But the first and foremost should be and is, they had faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. That if they were faithful and obedient to the testimony which they had, then what would happen? All is well. All is well. Our God will never us forsake, is how the hymn goes. So let me tell you about a story. And it happens to be my favorite pioneer story. There's a lot of cool stories, but this one's my favorite. And you'll quickly find out why. It's because it's about my ancestor. My name is Tom Pettit. My last name's Pettit. And one of my ancestors that walked across the plains, his name was Ed Pettit. Now, Ed and his family, the Pettits, they learned about the gospel while living in Queens, New York. And at that time, the saints had done all their historical things that we just talked about, and they were now in Nauvoo. So they get converted, they get baptized, and they move to Nauvoo as well. They end up, through a series of different things, they ended up with a lot of other saints, actually. Here's a little tidbit for you. There's thousands of saints on the Iowa side of the Mississippi River. So, and that's where the Pettits ended up. They were over with thousands of other saints on the Iowa side of the river. From their property, you can see the temple. And there's some documentation that they had some interaction with Joseph Smith. So it was cool. So, but Ed, the one that I come from, he was 8 years old when they left New York and came to Nauvoo. They weren't there very long before Ed's dad died. And that would be my third great grandpa. And Ed's dad passed away. And 2 weeks later, Ed's mom passed away. So now Ed is one of 5 kids that are orphaned. Ed is a little kid, 8, 9 years old at this point. They're on the Iowa side. So that was part of I mentioned that for a purpose, in that they were outside the church's nest, little community. And so a judge actually appointed them to an individual to be their guardian. And so Ed and his brothers and sister, they went and lived with this guardian. The guardian loved it because he had a big old farm, and now he's got a few young strapling boys to work hard on that farm. And so they did. And they worked there for a long time, or for a few years. And then the Saints, 1844 comes around, 1846 comes around, and Brigham and the Saints start to move west. Well, Ed has an older sister, and the older sister's not living with the guardian and the family. She's married. And so she and her husband are headed west. So Ed, being disassociated with the church during all this time, from the time that his parents died until the Saints started to move, he goes to his older brothers. And he says, hey, sister's going west with the Saints. I think we ought to go with them. And they're like, no, not a chance. Why would we do that? And he says, well, remember, Mom and Dad, why we came here. We had a testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is a little kid talking to his older brothers. And he says, I think we ought to go. And his brother said, no, life is fine here. We don't need to go out there. We'll find a place where God for us prepared. And we don't believe in that anymore, at little Ed. So no, we're going to stay put here in Iowa. And we live just fine. Well, Ed was determined to not stay behind. So he is 12 at this point, and he decides one night he's going to run away. He runs out of the house late at night and starts running, literally running, to catch up with the Saints in the company that his sister is a member of. Well, he doesn't get very far. He does catch up with the group, but he doesn't catch up with the group yet. He gets a little ways down, and the guardian and a couple of his brothers on horseback come find Ed, say, you're coming back with us, and they bring him back to the home there in Iowa. And so Ed, 12 years old, he determines this is not going to deter him, and he's going to try to make an escape again. But this time he wises up. He says, well, the guardian and my brothers, they're looking for me. Well, what if they can't find me? He's going to go in disguise. So he's sneaking out, and he grabs his sister's dress, and he's taking it with him, or he's taking it with him. He creeps down the stairs and through the living area of the house where his guardian is asleep in the chair. Very quietly, Ed goes out the front door, and now he starts running for his life. And he finally catches up with the company, with his sister. Now, the men in the group, the guys who were in charge, they said, well, we can't have a stowaway here because we're going to get in trouble with your guardian and your brothers. So when they come looking for you, we don't want to lie. So this is what we're going to do. When they come and they say, we're looking for a 12-year-old boy, we and everybody in the company is going to honestly say that the boy that you seek is not in camp. Not in camp. Well, because the reality is, they tell this little 12-year-old boy, you're going to be sleeping outside of camp, so that we could tell them that you're not in camp. You see, I mean, it's truthful. They're telling the truth, right? He's not in camp. He's sleeping outside. So remember, he took his dress. His brothers and his guardian are looking for a 12-year-old boy, not a 12-year-old girl. So he throws on the dress. Some women in the company fashion a wig, put it on him. Some refer to him as Mary Ann. So here's my grandpa walking across the plains in a dress with a wig, being referred to as Mary Ann. And yeah, that's the cool part. That's the funny part, humorous part. But remember, he can't sleep in camp. They want to be truthful, right? So here's a 12-year-old boy without a mom or a father sleeping out in the sagebrush among the coyotes. And he's willing to do it because he knows God has prepared a way, or has prepared a place for us far away in the West. And he wanted a piece of that blessing. And so he did that. He walked across the plains. He had his sister to care for him. But really, when he gets to Salt Lake, his sister's got his own family. Eventually, it would have dawned on him that he's really on his own at this age of 12. And as things happened, time went by, the years passed, and he grew up. And as an older teenager, he found employment in taking care of the horses for the men who were traveling from Salt Lake to San Bernardino, or from Salt Lake to San Francisco. So Ed would go along with missionaries and apostles as they were making those travels across the deserts. And he would care for the horses each night. The horse would be tired. He'd have to take care of them. And when I got married, some stories started to cross. My wife's maiden name is Rich. She's a descendant of Charles C. Rich, an apostle. On the other side of my family, I come from the Cannons. George Q. Cannon is one of my grandpas. And so they were apostle companionships. And so Charles and George. And so they would travel together to San Bernardino and at times to San Francisco. And who would take care of their horses? Ed. And so my kids have 3 grandpas that were sitting around the campfire out in the desert, going back and forth between Salt Lake and Southern California, and sometimes Salt Lake and the Bay Area. And I could just imagine my children's 3 grandpas sitting around the campfire and swapping pioneer stories. And so here's how it may have gone. George Q. Cannon would have said, and you know how it is around the campfire. Everybody's trying to one up the other story, right? It's like telling fishing stories. And this is all fictitious. Okay, this is just for fun. George Q. Cannon, he may have said, when we were coming across the Atlantic Ocean from Liverpool, we had to bury my mom at sea. We had the funeral and laid her to rest in the ocean. And George Q. Cannon could have said, it was my father who went to Carthage to make the death masks of the prophet and the patriarch, and to bring the bodies back to Nauvoo. Charles C. Rich could have said, well, unlike you boys, I decided that I was going to ask a woman to marry me without ever meeting her. And his story goes that a friend recommended a girl to him. He wrote her a letter, said by way of recommendation, I think we should get married. She writes a letter back to Charles C. Rich and says, well, if you feel good about it, I feel good about it. I'll come to Far West and let's get married. And they did. And so Charles and Sarah P. Rich got married. And then around this campfire, Ed Pettit, he would have said, well, those are pretty good stories, apostles. But I got one better for you. I walked across the plains in a dress, and they referred to me as Mary Ann. And probably he won the story of the night by telling that. But 3 nights ago, no kidding. 3 nights ago, I bumped into a guy by the name of Nathan Pettit. I have a son by the name of Nathan. This is a different Nathan. And I'm sure there's lots of Nathan Pettit, so I'm not, you're not going to know who this is. But we started talking. Hey, how are we related? We got the same cool last name. And we start talking, and we find out that our common ancestor is our great-grandfather, who was the son of this Ed Pettit I've been telling you about. And so we start talking, and I asked him, are you active in the church? Yeah. What about your kids? What about your dad? What about your cousins, uncles, aunts? Anybody you know that's related to you? He's like, yeah, they're all active. Strong members of the church, leaders in the church. We've all served missions. We've all helped bring others into the church. He says, what about you? I said, yeah, the same story for me. And we think of that little 12-year-old boy who had enough faith and enough courage to put on a dress without a mother and father, to live maybe somewhat of a comfort life, a comfortable life, or at least a life with security, to walk across the plains, to make his journey into, we'll find the place which God for us prepared. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm going because I've got faith that this is the true church of Jesus Christ. I've got a testimony of it, and so I'm going to go. And so he did. And so me and this guy 3 nights ago, we're just reflecting on this, how many thousands of his descendants can claim active membership in the church and have had received eternal blessings because of his faith. And we talk about the pioneers like it's something that happened. But what happened is still continuing on today. What would have happened had Ed not been as faithful as he would have been? Tens of thousands of descendants would not be able to claim the blessings of eternity. So it is my responsibility to not be a weak link, and to make sure that my tens of thousands of descendants can claim the blessings of eternity for decisions that I make. And that's the challenge to all of us, members of the church. And maybe that's why President Hinckley and President Faust particularly were so excited and involved to share the pioneer spirit with us in hopes of us catching it on, I think. Well, I told you about Ed and his journey. He left Nauvoo, so did many others. There's a street in Nauvoo called Parley Street, named after Parley P. Pratt. It's Parley Street. It was named while they were building out the city. It's not in memory of him. It was Parley Street in the days that Joseph was there. And it was down Parley Street that the saints would exit Nauvoo. At the dead end of Parley Street, if you just keep walking, you're going to get waist deep in water. That's where the Mississippi River is. And the saints would get out on Parley Street, and one by one they'd get ferried across to the Iowa side of the river. And if you go to Parley Street today, it's very solemn. It's very sacred, I think, experience to walk down that street and think of these pioneers and the faith that they had to leave it all behind for something completely unknown. And it was just faith. Now, we might liken that to ourselves in a number of different ways. But I'll point out one of what could be 20 points of interest that we can make on this, as far as how do we relate that to this Parley Street experience of them leaving everything behind and walking to the great unknown only by faith. And that is, today in the church, we have no doctrinal changes, but sometimes we do things differently than we used to. We minister instead of home teach. We do come follow me instead of 3 hours of church. As you're watching this live, we're currently in this quarantine thing. We're not going to church at all. And so there's been these changes, not changes, but refinements, ways that we do things better. And the sad thing is you and I, we both know people or know of people who, when these refinements or these ways that the Lord makes things better is not the way that it's always been, sometimes some testimonies waver, and sometimes people even leave the church. And how do we fall back on, what do we fall back on? Perhaps the faith of our fathers, these pioneers. They left everything that they knew behind to move forward with something new, having no understanding or knowledge other than faith that Jesus Christ is at the head of the church, and our God will never us forsake. All is well. All is well. Here's the testimony, brief testimonies of 3 of those people that were in this situation that I'm describing. This is Wilford Woodruff. I stopped my carriage on the top of a rolling prairie, and I had a splendid view. I could see the saints pouring out and gathering like clouds from the hills and dales, grove and prairie, with their teams, wagons, flocks, and herds by hundreds and thousands, as it were, until it looked like the movement of a great nation coming down to the Mississippi River to make our journey over to the Salt Lake. Here's one, Hosea Stout. He died in my arms about 4 o'clock. This was the second child which I've lost, both dying in my arms. He died with the whooping cough and black canker. We are entirely destitute of anything, even to eat, much less to nourish the sick. Bathsheba Smith. She's leaving Nauvoo. My last act in that precious spot was to tidy the rooms, sweep up the floor, and set the broom in its acquainted place behind the door. Then, with emotions in my heart, I gently closed the door and faced an unknown future. Faced it with faith in God and with no less assurance of the ultimate establishment of the gospel in the West and of its true, enduring principles than I had felt in those trying scenes in Missouri. And finally, I'll leave you this quote. George Q. Cannon. Those of us who can remember when we were compelled to abandon Nauvoo, when the winter was so inclement, know how dark and gloomy the circumstances of the saints were, with the mobs surrounding our outer settlements and threatening to destroy us, and how trying it was to the faith of the people of God. The word was to cross the Mississippi and launch out into an unknown wilderness. To go where? No one knew. Who knew anything of the terrors of the journey thither, or the dangers that might have to be met and contended with? Who knew anything about the country to be traversed? Moving out with faith that was undisturbed by its unknown terrors. Excuse me, let me say that again. Moving out with faith that was undisturbed by its unknown terrors. It was by faith that this was accomplished. Faith and faith alone. I've got a quote I'd like to read to you. This is a story, and it was this story that President Hinckley read this story in General Conference. Now, 60,000 saints crossed the plains. Not all of them came from Nauvoo. Some of them came many years after Nauvoo had been abandoned. Some of them came by rail most of the way. Some of them had started over in Liverpool and came by ship. And so 60,000 who claim to be a pioneer, who have crossed the plains in some way, in some time, each have their own unique story. A lot of them, most of them, came without physical ailments. They did it. They got across, no problem. Some of them had big-time ailments, physical ailments. Most notably, of course, is the Martin and the Willie handcart companies. They were some of the most tragic, no doubt, of course. And you know a little bit about their story. I want to share with you a story from that experience, a family who was traveling with the Martin handcart company. And I'm quoting here President Hinckley, who's quoting a journal. We traveled, and this is a 13-year-old girl telling the story, or a woman telling the story of what happened when she was 13. We traveled from 15 to 25 miles a day till we got to the Platte River. We caught up with the handcart companies that day. I watched the ox cross the river. There was great lumps of ice floating down the river. It was bitter cold. The next morning, there were 14 dead. We went back to camp and had our prayers and sang, "Come, come, ye saints." I wondered what made my mother cry that night. The next morning, my little sister was born. It was the 23rd of September. We named her Edith. She lived 6 weeks and died. She was buried at the last crossing of the Sweetwater. We ran into heavy snow. I became lost in the snow. My feet and legs were frozen. The men rubbed me with snow. They put my feet in a bucket of water. The pain was terrible. When we arrived at Devil's Gate, it was bitter cold. We left many of our company there. My brother James was as well as he ever was, and when he went to bed that night, In the morning, he was dead. My feet were frozen, also my brothers and sisters. It was nothing but snow everywhere in the bitter Wyoming wind. We could not drive the pegs in our tents. We did not know what would become of us. Then one night, a man came into our camp and told us Brigham Young had sent men in teams to help us. We sang songs, some danced, and some cried. My mother had never got well. She died between the Little and Big Mountains. She was 43 years old. We arrived in Salt Lake City at 9 o'clock at night on the 11th of December, 1856. There, three out of the four that were living were frozen. My mother was dead in the wagon. Early next morning, Brigham Young came. When he saw our conditions, our feet frozen and our mother dead, tears rolled down his cheeks. The doctor amputated my toes while my sisters were dressing mother for her grave. When my feet were fixed, they carried us in to see our mother for the last time. Oh, how did we stand it? That afternoon she was buried. I have thought often of my mother's words before we left England. Molly, I want to go to Zion while my children are small, so they can be raised in the gospel of Christ. For I know this is the true church. A few years later, in a Sunday school meeting in Cedar City, Utah, some people would start to criticize the leaders of the Martin Handcart Company. Why did they leave so late in the season? Why did they do this? Why didn't they do that? There's an old man in the corner, and he says in his journal, finally he could take it no more. He stood up and he said this to that group after announcing that he had been in the Martin Handcart Company. I have pulled my handcart when I was so weak and weary from illness and lack of food that I could barely put one foot ahead of the other. I have looked ahead and seen a patch of sand or a hill slope, and I have said, I can only go that far, and there I must give up, for I cannot pull the load through it. I have gone on to that sand, and when I reached it, it began pushing me. I have looked back many times to see who was pushing my cart, but my eyes saw no one. I knew then that the angels of God were there. Was I sorry that I chose to come by handcart? No, neither then nor any minute of my life since. The price we paid to become acquainted with God was a privilege to pay. And I am thankful that I was privileged to come in the Martin Handcart Company. And so it can be with us. So our trials and our troubles, our heartaches, our fears, our unknowns are different than the pioneers, but not so different that we can't do as they did. Was I sad that I came by handcart? No, he says, because it was a privilege to come to know God through our infirmities. And so it is with us. We have things that we're going through in our lives, and those things that can bring us closer to Christ if we allow it to. And how can we allow it to? By this very thing I'm about to read to you. Now, this is a quote written by a man who was a historian of American history, not a member of our church. Don't know what he thought of our church. I do know what he thought about our pioneer ancestors, though. He says this, not understanding the things that we've been talking about tonight, not understanding that it was faith that moved them, faith that compelled them to follow the prophet. And it was faith that helped them endure the things that they went through. He didn't understand those things. But this is what he said anyway. Most of them, referring to the pioneers, most of them, until they were herded from their crowded immigrant ship and dumped here on the brink of the West, had never pitched a tent, slept on the ground, cooked outdoors, built a campfire. They had not even the rudimentary skills that make frontiersmen. But, as it turned out, they had some of the stuff that makes heroes. And the stuff that makes heroes is a testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ and faith and courage to act on that testimony, to put that testimony into action. These are the things that we can learn from our pioneers. And as I started this tonight, I told you I wasn't going to tell you many stories, but focus more on why we tell the stories and why we learn about this wonderful pioneer heritage that we all love and enjoy. I'm grateful to have a testimony of that what they got can be earned by me as well. That through faith we can enjoy all the blessings that a loving Heavenly Father can provide to us. That's why these stories are great. That's why I love them, and that this church is true. And I say it in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
For more videos about our church history, make sure to subscribe.